Released on September 1st, 1983, The Armageddon Rag is the last novel that George R.R. Martin wrote before he left his career in literature for a career in Hollywood. A career he would eventually then leave as well, for a time. But what was it about this book that made George leave the world of book writing and enter into the world of script writing? Well, my name is The Advocate, and today I'm an advocate for answering just that. Like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy. So a long time ago, long before Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, and even long before George was writing scripts for a 1980s revival of The Twilight Zone, the show that Black Mirror takes huge inspiration from, George was writing short stories for the literature market. In fact, he wrote so many short stories back then that in the 1970s, he eventually grew so tired of writing so many short stories that he decided to begin taking a crack at writing longer form fiction. His first long-form full-length novel would wind up being a book titled Dying of the Light, a book which we've previously reviewed on this channel. And although that book didn't exactly light George R.R. Martin's bank account on fire, it did sell just enough copies to convince his publishers to give George another crack at writing another novel. That book sold even more copies, and eventually his publishers gave him an even bigger advance to write another book, which he would then call Fever Dream, a fantastic book and what would wind up being George R.R. Martin's most successful non-A Song of Ice and Fire novel to date. It sold so well that, although nothing close to the millions of sales that A Song of Ice and Fire generates on a yearly basis, but still well enough, that Martin was able to negotiate an advance from his publisher to pay him 6 figures for a new book that George R.R. Martin had been passionately working on. A book that was heavily inspired by his love for the 60s and hippie culture and rock and roll. A book called The Armageddon Rag. Only for it to be met with dismal sales. Because despite George pouring his blood, sweat, and tears into this passion project of his, The Armageddon Rag would wind up being a humongous, spectacular commercial failure. Following this failure, George would never write another full-length novel ever again. At least not for a while. Had this book been a more viable financial success, and had George sold all the copies he'd wanted to on this book and maybe gotten an even bigger advance for another book down the line, George may never have gotten called up to work in Hollywood, or have gotten soured on Hollywood, which would then lead him to write a Game of Thrones. So I'm not saying it's because of the Armageddon Rag we have a Game of Thrones, but I'm also, yes, saying that. But given all this bad reputation for the Armageddon Rag, do I think this book is deserving of its status as the biggest failure of George R.R. Martin's literary career? Well, having read this book, I would say no, that's pretty harsh. But also having read this book, and also hindsight being 2020, I can definitely see why this book didn't sell as well as George had hoped, at least when it first came out. Because with exception of a few spelling mistakes, the Armageddon Rag is actually George R.R. Martin's most polished non-A Song of Ice and Fire work that I personally have read. The prose is strong, the imagery is vivid, the wordplay is masterful. Even the story here, which we'll delve into here shortly, is pretty intriguing. I know enjoyment of any entertainment medium is ultimately subjective, but with as many objective measures as we can quantify, the Armageddon Rag is, by most definitions, a very strong and polished book. However, despite the writing here, I do think the ultimate commercial pitfall for this story ultimately comes down to its concept. Because in 1983, I just don't think as many people were as interested in looking back on the flower power hippie days of the late 1960s as George was. For you see, without delving too deeply into spoilers, this book essentially follows a George R.R. Martin stand-in via the character of Sandy Blair, who goes on this cross-country adventure where he interviews various members of a former 1960s rock and roll band called the Nazgul, a play on the actual Nazgul from the Lord of the Rings franchise. And as Sandy does this, he regales all his great memories of the 1960s, the hippies wanting to change the world, Woodstock, the Beatles, all that fun stuff. And while he does all this, he also compares what the 1960s was to what the modern day is, which in the case of this book is the early 1980s, what with capitalism, war in the Middle East, McDonald's chicken McNuggets with all those artificial chemicals and preservatives, all that not so fun stuff. Except for the chicken McNuggets, those artificial chemicals do sound pretty yummy right about now. It all ultimately culminates in a book that is about nostalgically harkening back to the 1960s during a time period when a lot of people have kind of just moved on from the 60s. Which is kind of ironic, as that's exactly why I think this book did not sell as well as George had hoped. Because the general readership demographic had likely also moved on from the 1960s by the time 1983 rolled around. I mean, who wants to read a book about the past when within that same year you can watch Michael Jackson's Thriller music video on repeat, watch the A-Team on TV, or see Luke Skywalker finally getting his rematch against Darth Vader on the big screen? Nostalgia definitely works best when the current time period sucks. The reason Stranger Things worked so well when it was first released was because, in addition to it just being a great story, the 1980s sure seemed a heck of a lot more appealing of a time period than whatever the heck else was going on when Stranger Things was released in the late 2010s. I mean, entertainment-wise, what else did we have? Star Wars The Last Jedi? The Rise of Skywalker? The shitty seasons of Game of Thrones? Ugh, no thanks. I'll take the 80s, please. A book that is a love letter to the 60s, more specifically a book that is a love letter to the hippie Creedence Clearwater Revival, The Doors, Jimi Hendrix version of the 60s that George personally experienced and loved so much, is way too niche and unmarketable of a genre to have sold well in the Michael Jackson early 80s. It just didn't work. So, with all that said, despite this book's prior unmarketability in the 1980s, did I, in the modern day, enjoy reading the Armageddon Rag? Actually, yeah. I did enjoy it. Despite a few qualms that I have with the story, which we'll delve into here shortly, I actually thought the Armageddon Rag was a mostly groovy groove. That said, do I think you will enjoy the Armageddon Rag? Well, that depends on what kind of crazy cat you are. Cat number 1. If you're someone who has never read a George R.R. Martin book before, and this is your first ever exposure to George's bibliography, oh boy, do I think you might be in for a rough time. The Armageddon Rag is definitely a passion project from George, and he indulges in a lot of his passions and interests throughout this entire novel. Flower power, fight the man, down with capitalism, up with rock and roll. And if you're someone who is not familiar with George's interests, or you're perhaps looking for something that is not that, then you're definitely not going to like this book. Cat number 2. If you're someone whose only exposure to George has been through his A Song of Ice and Fire series, and are just wanting to see what else is within his literary repertoire, then I think you might want to start your non-A Song of Ice and Fire journey elsewhere. Everything I said about George in my Cat number 1 explanation definitely applies here, as this book is incredibly niche and super specific to George and his passions. And although there's nothing wrong with wanting to indulge in George's interests, I do honestly think it's only because I've read some of George's other non-A Song of Ice and Fire works that I'm even able to recognize and appreciate a lot of his personal interests within this book. Cat number 3. If you're someone who is familiar with George R.R. Martin's bibliography, but for some reason has yet to read the Armageddon Rag, then, I mean, yeah, you've read all of his other works, so you may as well read this book. But I do think if you are within that group, then you probably will mostly enjoy this book. Again, there's a lot here where you can really feel George pouring his heart and soul into this story. And although you could probably see that passion if you decide to pick this book up before any other of George R.R. Martin's non-A Song of Ice and Fire works, I do think the passion here is more recognizable if you have read some of those other works. But looking beyond all of George's personal passions here, I do think this story in and of itself is still an engaging read. Without delving too deeply into spoilers, this story begins with a murder mystery a la Game of Thrones, and it's that intrigue of wanting to find out how and why this murder happened that pushes the narrative forward. Now, I will say, despite the immersion that I personally felt with this story, there are some definite rough spots here that I personally did have to power through. Again, George really loves the 60s. More specifically, his version of the 60s. And although that version of the 60s that he experienced is totally real and totally valid, it can make for a rather inaccessible and sometimes difficult read. I have no idea who Froggy the Gremlin is. I have no idea what the Smilin' Ed McConnell show is, and George having his characters constantly make references to these things definitely left me feeling occasionally lost throughout this story. Going back to Stranger Things, I think part of the reason why the nostalgia within that show works so well is because the 80s references it does make, E.T., Ghostbusters, The Terminator, Back to the Future, have such a huge cultural mass appeal that you could show a movie poster of any one of those properties to the average Joe walking down the street, and chances are they will instantly recognize it. Meanwhile, the references that George makes here to the 60s, I don't think many people will recognize. These references are super specific to George's own upbringing, and although there's nothing wrong with that, I can't imagine there being many readers who would be able to connect with these references as easily as George does. However, despite all these super niche references, I would still say that the Armageddon Rag is still thankfully a story first, references second kind of story. And although the nostalgic callbacks can become a little too much, albeit still nothing close to the indulgent references and callbacks we see in something like Ready Player One, the story of Sandy Blair's investigative journalism into the murder mystery and his interviews with the members of the Nazgul Band is still the central thoroughline that drives the narrative forward, and it drives it forward in a pretty engaging way. But before we wrap up this review, there's just a few spoilery things I want to talk about. So if you don't mind, I think now is as good a time as any to delve into spoilers. If you have not read the Armageddon Rag, then definitely feel free to click on those timestamps below to skip to my final thoughts on this book. Otherwise, if you have read the Armageddon Rag, then stick around and let's get spoilery. So I will say, despite my reading experience with George's other works being a personal boon for me when it comes to developing a larger appreciation for this book and for George's personal passions, it did also inadvertently create a bit of a double-edged sword where I've read so much of George's other works that I quickly learned to recognize and pick up on a lot of his writing patterns and tropes. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as every author, to some extent, has a certain well of tropes that they like to pull from, but I definitely did instantly see a lot of George's tropes here in the Armageddon Rag, more than I did in some of his other works. You have a George R.R. Martin stand-in who likes to make delightfully droll jokes. You have a Roose Bolton-like villain who partakes in bloodletting and is ultimately killed by an even more impassioned member of his tribe. You have all this prophecy about dark magic and mystical powers and people trying to use that magic for their own gain, even though it ultimately becomes their undoing because magic in a George R.R. Martin book is ethereal and unpredictable and you cannot control it. You have the physical manifestation of a character's hopes and fears taking shape as this character hits a mental rock bottom. And at the end of it all, you have the idea that the memory of a person can live on in the hearts and minds of the people, either through music or story. There are a ton of tropes here that definitely make this book the most George R.R. Martin-iest book that George R.R. Martin has ever written. And although I did ultimately come away appreciating this story for what it was, there were moments throughout this book where those tropes I definitely saw coming from a mile away. I immediately predicted that Ananda would ultimately be revealed as the story's big bad, as it was kind of getting pretty obvious that she was the more impassioned Ramsay Bolton-like person within Eden Morse/Roose Bolton's tribe. And then I also predicted that the Armageddon Rag plot that Eden and Ananda were trying to scheme up would ultimately fail because this story's dark magic, like many George R.R. Martin novels, is not something that can easily be controlled. Looking closer at that Armageddon ending, although I do personally understand why George ultimately chose to have the Armageddon Rag scheme ultimately fizzle out in the end rather than explode into some massive supernatural catastrophe, I will admit that the climax itself did leave me feeling a little emotionally underwhelmed. This story builds and builds towards this final confrontation at West Mesa where Sandy Blair prepares to fire a rifle at the members of the Nazgul band as a sort of mirror image of what had happened more than a decade prior, where Patrick Henry Hobbins was shot and killed. And although Sandy contemplates his decision, he ultimately chooses not to fire the gun and instead lets the performance play out. And although this does ultimately foil Ananda's plan to ignite this great big revolution that would have consumed the world, I was still left feeling slightly disappointed by the lack of catharsis here. Or more specifically, the lack of a meaningful on-page consequence for Ananda and all the blood and murder shtick she pulled. Now, to be fair, this ending did lead to a really sweet moment where the ghost of Patrick Henry Hobbins smiles one last time at the concert he was finally able to play at and finish, before peacefully departing from Larry Richmond's body alongside the ghosts of other deceased rock and rollers. And I actually thought that scene was pretty neat, but overall, the lack of any immediate follow-up to Ananda's actions felt rather anticlimactic. It did leave me disappointed, and I don't think this ending bodes very well for a satisfying ending for the A Song of Ice and Fire series. That said, I did still enjoy some of the other narrative goalposts within this story, such as Eden Morse initially being revealed as the Roose Bolton bloodletter, or Larry Richmond being possessed by the resurrected soul of the deceased Patrick Henry Hobbins. Those reveals genuinely kept me intrigued and definitely kept me turning the page in order to find out what happens next. But I think what stood out to me more than that, more than the tropes and more than the Roose Bolton bloodletting magic shenanigans and the dead people possessions, is the prevailing theme that lies at the center of this story. The theme that time moves on and people change, and no matter how hard you desperately try to recreate or recapture an era that has long since passed, time marches forward whether you like it or not. And although there's nothing inherently wrong with reminiscing on the past, there is a danger in becoming too consumed by that nostalgia. Because if you spend too much time obsessing over what once was, you risk stunting your own personal growth within the present and risk getting left even further behind by an ever-changing world. There's a passage here in chapter 5 that I thought was relatively profound, where Sandy is bemoaning the fact that, this baby boomer generation was the most impassioned generation, this generation that really wanted to change the world, and he's bemoaning the fact that at the end of the day, it truly does feel like nothing was changed, but Maggie denotes to Sandy that, well, actually, things did change for the better. All of our hard work, even though maybe it didn't pay off exactly the way we wanted it to, it did change some things within this world for the better. And it's that kind of glass half full perspective where even though Sandy Blair and even though maybe some of the more impassioned members of the baby boomer generation didn't get things exactly the way they wanted it to, they did still have some kind of impact in their own way, even if they couldn't see it at first. And even though I do think George manifests this idea a little too tritely and way too saccharine for my liking with this almost unnecessarily sweet epilogue ending, I do still appreciate the underlying idea that hard work can lead to a positive change. And that's a groovy groove. Because at the end of the day, despite my qualms with the inaccessibility of some of these 60s references here, or the rather anticlimactic ending, the Armageddon Rag is in fact a groovy groove. But that, my friends, is my review of George R.R. Martin's The Armageddon Rag. What did you think of this story? Do you agree with my assessment? Well, comment below and let me know. I do eventually want to create a video where we rank all of George R.R. Martin's full-length non-A Song of Ice and Fire novels from worst to best, and although I still do need to read a couple more books before I'm able to completely solidify my list, I will say that I do think I enjoyed my time more with the Armageddon Rag than I did with Dying of the Light. Although I do think that the thematic writing for Dying of the Light is probably stronger when compared to this book, I definitely did find myself more emotionally invested in Sandy Blair's plight here than I ever did with Dirk Tallarian's. Not to mention, Dying of the Light can be a real slog to get through, so in the short term anyway, the Armageddon Rag is definitely better. But hey, we still got a couple more books to read, so we'll see how that list eventually shapes out. But until then, thank you all so very much for watching this video. It truly does mean the world to me. And I'll see you guys next time. The Advocate, out.